Hey everybody, this is Art by Zicky, and in this video I will be painting Swamp Thing. So after doing a few thumbnails, I decided this was the composition I wanted to go with, and I did a quick sketch in Autodesk Sketchbook just to sort of show me where everything is going to be, where all the elements are going to be, and how I'm going to be doing my lighting, my shading. Then I added in some color for a little color study so I could sort of see just how the colors were all going to play off of each other. As you see throughout the video, some of these things change, some stay the same. Sort of keep what you like, get rid of what you don't. So then I have a chance to do a more refined sketch on my 16 by 20 canvas and begin painting. Now, I use a technique that I don't normally use. This is the first time I've been doing this. Normally, how I would do this is I would render my painting in black and white using paint first, which I learned from an Alex Ross book that I read many years ago. But recently, I learned of a technique where people had been doing the same thing, only using colored pencil instead. So I went over my entire drawing with colored pencil to sort of render in all of the shadows and all of the line work, and then began to paint over it. Now, initially, I had to wet the surface, and this may work well. I've seen it work on paper, but I would not recommend using the colored pencil technique on canvas, as the instant I touched it with the water, everything smudged everywhere. It was really brutal. Even after spraying it with a sealer to sort of keep it from doing that, I still had the same problem. And while I was doing my base tones, as you see the blues and the greens here, I was having the same problem using the water. Pretty much now that there was a sealer on it, it was beading, running. It was just horrific. But everything after that went pretty smoothly. For the first time, also, I'm using matte medium rather than water to mix my paint. It was a technique used by Ariel Olivieri, a famous painter, and I'd been itching to try it, so I decided to try it with this. As you see, I'm just darkening up the sky a little bit there, trying to bring out all of those other elements. Rather than loading them on top, I'm just sort of bringing everything out from where it already is. So as you can see, there's sort of hints of the moon in behind here, and how I accomplished that was just by using a little bit of gray paint mixed with this Mediterranean blue that I'm using for the sky. I'm using a Jubilee green on the bottom, which is a really, really brilliant green, really fun to work with. The Mediterranean blue, the paint that I have is not of a very good quality, but the color is really nice, but the paint is lumpy and clumpy, and it's not much fun to work with. I'm thinking of picking up some new paints pretty soon. So I'm just sort of filling in all of these areas that are going to be deep blue sky, bringing all of the foreground elements a little bit more forward, and trying to bring out that moon in the background there. It's really pretty simple stuff. You just start layering darker and darker shades of the same color. And I'm not really trying to be super clean with my lines around my tree branches and everything there, because I will be coming at that afterwards and layering paint over it. You can find that when you're using acrylics, it isn't really that hard to layer things on top of other things. Especially I'm finding with this matte medium, as I say, using it for the first time, I really did enjoy this whole painting process. I've been using water this entire time to mix my paints and to sort of thin them out. But the matte medium sort of makes your paint stay, keep from drying out on the palette for a longer time, so you have more time to use it. I also picked up a hair dryer to dry certain areas when I want to sort of work on them right away. Barring that, seeing as it's such a large piece, you can sort of work on an area and move to another area, and by the time you're done with the second area, the first one is dry, and you can proceed to work on that some more. So I'm just sort of coming in around Swamp Thing, sort of silhouette, I guess you would say, and sort of bringing out some clouds, not adding any color, really, not adding any white or anything. Just sort of bringing it out of the light base tone that I already had there, covering over certain areas with the darker base tone. So now I've got the moon in there. Some of this stuff didn't end up getting filmed because my camera had run out of juice. I had added some titanium white to the moon, I believe, and around the rim. Mixed it with some of that Mediterranean blue so that it wasn't so jarring. And now we're moving on to the water. I wanted it to look a little bit swampier, a little bit murkier. I mean, that's where we are. So I'm taking that same Jubilee green, and I believe I just mixed it with some black. I may have mixed it with another darker color, maybe a hunter green or something like that. And just sort of adding in shadows where I think there should be, making the water a bit more murky, but keeping those other elements free so that I can work on them later. And behind Swamp Thing, I sort of want to make keep the water that base green color because that's where I'm going to be adding in my moon's reflection. So I'm just sort of adding some shading underneath Swamp Thing, seeing as our light source would be typically mostly the moon behind him in the sky. So all of our shadows are sort of coming towards us. And just adding in some more shadow around the water here. I found it's very helpful to use sort of a zigzag pattern with my background here. As you can see, I sort of have banks of the swamp here with the grass and the dirt and trees in the background and some dead branches and our floating log in the foreground here and another little bank in the foreground. And it's all sort of coming in a zigzag sort of pattern that kind of gives you the illusion of depth. Doing the same thing really with the tree branches that are in the foreground, sort of framing Swamp Thing in the image and cutting into that moon a little bit and placing it more into the background. So I'm just going to darken up a bit more of this water, make it as murky as possible. We're not dealing with a nice clean coast, we're dealing with water that's full of algae and plant life, everything else. So now I'm sort of putting in the reflection of the moon here. This time, mixing that titanium white with the Jubilee green rather than the Mediterranean blue, so that I'm really only getting the whites of the moon reflected onto the water, but lighter and lighter shades of green, so that water itself is being reflected. Just on the very tops, I'm staying the very top where you would see the horizon line. I'm sort of going the brightest and coming a bit dimmer as you come out. Now I'm sort of going to darken up the edges of the shoreline here to bring out all of those shapes. I will take a darker green and stipple it with my brush here and just sort of dab all over my base green colors. And once that's done, I will take a slightly lighter green, do the same thing, cover it. I'm also using tones of yellow ochre and straw, I believe. I think I used, must have been 5 different color greens in this, all sort of the most earthy tones that I could find. Only a couple of different shades of brown. When I get into the browns, I'm using mostly burnt sienna, which is typically the brown that you would use, but I do believe I found a maple sort of brown, which I tend to use for the log in the foreground, just to sort of give it more of a different shade. I think I might even have added some dark gray into it just to give it more of that dead look. So as for the composition, I really felt it was a lot stronger. I wanted to give that eerie feeling of just Swamp Thing being the swamp monster walking alone in the swamp in the night with the moon in the background, typical sort of horror magazine cover, and really give that sense of darkness and I guess alone that he would feel walking through the swamp and sort of just being with the trees. If you don't, a little bit of background on Swamp Thing. He was created by comic book writer Len Wein and artist Bernie Wrightson back in the early 1970s. And in his first incarnations, scientist Alec Holland and his wife were commissioned to concoct a bio-growth formula in the middle of this swamp. And after sort of being bullied by some other criminals that kind of wanted in on it and sending them away, they were then attacked. Alec Holland's wife was killed. Alec was burned by his own chemicals in the laboratory, ran into the swamp to sort of put the fire out, and emerged as this swamp monster. Initially, a man who had become a monster, and was then, of course, how it had looked, that this monster, who was unrecognizable to even his closest friends, had murdered the Hollands himself, and they gave chase to him for most of that series. Later on in the 1980s, Alan Moore decided to tweak the character's origins a little bit, which I sort of prefer, which a lot of people preferred, I suppose, that Alec, or Swamp Thing himself, is not actually Alec Holland the man, but that Alec Holland actually died in the swamp, and his consciousness was somehow transferred into a being of total plant life. He's an elemental plant being that is sort of the protector of the green, which is basically what they call all plant life on Earth. As for power set, he has the ability to connect with all plant life all across the globe. He has control over all plant life, not only Earthen plant life, but alien plant life as well. He can produce it all, grow it, whether he knows the biological makeup of it or not. He can grow himself to size. He's normally the size of a man or slightly larger, kind of like a hulking sort of monster, but he can actually use the plant life around him to grow his body into an enormous size. He can stretch out his limbs using the plant life around him. He can't really be hurt. Bullets can just pass right through him, and he can just reform. And he, as I say, he's super strong. So he's a pretty big powerhouse in the DC universe, and he's had many incarnations over the years. But basically, that's what this guy is all about, and that's what I'm trying to achieve. Sort of this sort of lonely character who sort of just wants to be left alone, but to protect what he believes is important in the world. And anyway, back to the painting part. That's my nerding out for a bit, but back to the painting part. As you see, I've finished off the log in the foreground. I've done the initial base browns on the branches. The log is mostly finished. As you see, that base green that I had put on these trees was really helpful with bringing out sort of the mossier textures by just simply making the paint thinner in those areas or not painting them at all. And I will be adding over top with some moss. Now I'm sort of adding in the shadows to bring out those branches and those limbs a bit more. And what we see here is basically a finished background. I was planning on bringing out the airbrush to sort of do the mist in the background, but it turned out I didn't have to. I was able to just use my brush, using a bit of that titanium white mixed with the Mediterranean blue. I wanted to make sure that when I was doing my lighting, I would mix things with that Mediterranean blue to sort of give that eerie moonlit effect to all of the elements. So as you can see up in the tree branches, I may have done that off camera. I started off with a burnt sienna sort of brown, but then mixed in some grays and lightened it up a bit to add to some of the highlights and some of the crooked bark. And then I took some white and some Mediterranean blue and just did sort of the outer edges to give it that luminous quality. Now working on Swamp Thing, I wanted to make sure that I didn't just make him straight up green. I mean, he would look kind of flat. So I did have him the base Jubilee green. I mixed up a darker version to and some matte medium to sort of do the shadow, and then used some darker hunter greens, I believe, or forest greens. I stippled around some parts of his body, on his shoulders, his chest, and things to make it kind of look leafy. As I do already have the lines and all through him that sort of make it look like he's wrapped in vines and leaves and things like that, but still keeping that physiology of a man. And mixing the green itself with that yellow ochre and those straw colors to sort of make, I don't know, if maybe like a pickle brine sort of color, yellowish green that I would use in the highlighted areas, mainly where his chest would pop out from the rest of his body, his shoulders, his legs. There's certain vines going down that have a lot of those brown in it. He looks dirty. He looks murky. He's got those little leaves coming off of his arms, and and vines and things hanging down from him. And I went, as you can see, with my white marker in on the eyes at first, and then painted in a bit of red. And at the very, very end, I mixed some more of that bright red with a tiny bit of yellow, just to make sort of an orangey dot pupil, really. That's barely visible in this video, I guess, from how far the camera is away, but really sets it off. Around the edges, as I'm doing the highlights, as I'm doing all the little detailing, once I'm finished with the browns and the yellows and the greens, I mix some more of my white with some more of that Mediterranean blue, so that I can do just sort of the highlights on his shoulders, on the top of his head, just on the edges, to really give the effect of the moonlight hitting his body. And as I see, I'm just touching up on some elements here in the foreground, tips of the branches, adding those bluish white hues just to the edges. And as you can see, the moss I've added down to the log in the foreground. I don't know if I mentioned that. I dabbed some different greens there, and you can't quite see, but I topped it off with some of those yellowish greens just to give it a little bit more depth, which is a real easy way if you're doing backgrounds with a lot of foliage. You just sort of stipple your brush and dab varying layers of greens and yellows and even whatever hues you're looking for. And it really does give the impression of depth in a piece. As long as you have some darks in there with your bright colors, it won't look so flat. So I believe right here is where I'm sort of finishing up and putting in those bluish white highlights just on the very edges of the silhouette, and the rounded edges, the very forward-facing edges of whatever body parts would be protruding from him, keeping sort of the bottom half of him a bit more shaded, because he is sort of hunched over and his shadow is going over his body and his legs and things like that. So finally I'm signing it with my paint marker, a little larger than I normally would. The paint marker I thought would allow for some more control, but didn't turn out that way. But I think it really doesn't take that much away from it. And there we have our finished piece. So I really like how this turned out. Everything I was trying to achieve really sort of happened. I have that sort of spooky feeling, Swamp Thing walking through the swamp. I loved using the matte medium as opposed to water. I think that's how I'll do it from now on. So if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like, share it with somebody who might enjoy it, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. I do plan on doing more videos like this in the future, and I do have some art-related and process-related videos already. So other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great day.